Japan's Yakuza groups have long been a major part of Japanese society. Looking from the outside, one might think that these criminal organizations have exclusive Japanese membership. But the reality is that there are many ethnic minorities in Japan's underworld and many hold important positions. The most prominent ethnic minority in Japan's Yakuza is undoubtedly the Koreans. Although Koreans make up 0.5% of Japan's population, it is believed that they make up for around 30% of Yakuza members today. For decades, Koreans have had a large presence in Japan's criminal world, and many of them played an important role in the development of the most powerful Yakuza organizations. In this video, we will cover the full history of how Koreans made their way into Japanese organized crime. The history of Korean Yakuza begins with the early history of Koreans in Japan, who are known as Zainichi Koreans. The origins of the Zainichi began with the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876. This treaty created an exchange of goods and people between the two nations and eventually led to Japan's complete annexation of the Korean peninsula in 1910. From early Japanese rule up to World War II, many Koreans immigrated to Japan for cheap labor or military conscriptions. Hundreds of thousands of Koreans who relocated to Japan became Japanese citizens and created permanent communities. In Japan, these Koreans did not have it easy. They faced discrimination heavily and were restricted to only working hard manual labor jobs. Since the average Korean in Japan was poor and not accepted by the Japanese citizens, many of them became involved with criminal activity. In Japan, the general population associated Koreans with violence and became fearful of them. Not only were Koreans causing mayhem on the streets, some were even causing trouble with the government. Many Koreans hated the Japanese government because of the intense oppression and abuse that Japan caused to mainland Korea. This led to the many Korean independence fighters. Koreans such as Pak Yeol and Lee Bong-chang were arrested for trying to assassinate the Emperor of Japan. These events hurt the Zainichi Koreans' reputation even further. However, not all Japanese discriminated against Koreans. Some Koreans came to realize that the only Japanese who didn't discriminate against them were the Yakuza. Japanese Yakuza allied with Korean gangs and allowed Koreans to join their crime families. In the Japanese underworld, ethnicity is not important, and all are seen as brothers in crime. This culture of acceptance has led to many Koreans joining or being easily recruited into organized crime groups. Now, let's discuss the actual figures. One of the first Koreans in the Yakuza was a man named Hayashi. Hayashi was born in Taedong, Korea in 1909, but his family moved to Japan when he was 5. Hayashi joined a Yakuza society under the leadership of the famous Toyama Mitsuru. He was sent by Mitsuru to run the colonial branch of the Yakuza in Seoul. By the 1930s, most of Korea's crime fell under his control. Most of his henchmen were Japanese, but many Koreans, such as Kim Dong-hwae, worked for him as well. Hayashi stayed in power until Korea's independence from Japan after World War II, and Korean gangster named Kim Do-han replaced the Japanese Yakuza. Although Hayashi was powerful in Korea, around this time there were no powerful Korean gangsters in Japan. From the 1930s all the way up to World War II, there weren't many opportunities for Korean gangsters in Japan. Not only was there massive chaos from the war, a large population of Korean males were forced to serve in the Japanese army. To add insult to injury, at the end of World War II, the Zainichi were stripped of Japanese citizenship and now considered foreigners. Now, not only were they facing discrimination from the general society, they were also considered alien residents by the state as well. This created an even tougher situation for the Zainichi Koreans who were already struggling for decades. However, things were about to change. During the post-war period in Japan with American occupation, many Japanese Yakuza were arrested by the US for their close ties to the wartime government. The country was also in ruins and necessities were scarce. This gave Korean gangsters a lucrative opportunity to set up black markets in the streets of Japan. At this time, there were around 600,000 ethnic Koreans in Japan, but their small numbers couldn't be overlooked. Nationwide, Korean gangs such as the Mayu Kai ran certain streets and made money off the illegal sales of pots, pans, kettles, plates, silverware, cooking oil, rice, tea, leather, and electrical goods. Also, there was a demand for military equipment and weapons from the war. One prominent Korean gangster to exploit the black market scene was the infamous Machi Hisayuki. Hisayuki is considered a legend in the history of Japanese organized crime and is seen as the main figure who paved the way for Korean gangsters. Hisayuki was born Chong Gwang-yong in Tokyo in 1923 as a first-generation Zainichi Korean. After World War II, he joined a Korean gang in Tokyo and made a lot of money in the black markets. In 1948, Hisayuki decided to create his own Korean gang called the Toseikai. The gang grew to hundreds of members and they dominated the streets of Tokyo. After they set up their headquarters in the Ginza district of Tokyo, the Toseikai became the first ethnic Korean gang to become an official Yakuza crime syndicate. Membership grew to almost 1,000 members and Koreans began to get more respect in the underworld. Another important Zainichi Korean figure from this time period is Jiro Yanagawa. Jiro Yanagawa was born Yang Won-suk in Busan, Korea in 1923. He moved to Osaka, Japan with his family at the age of 7. Later on, he got involved in crime as a young man and teamed up with another ethnic Korean named Kotaro Tanikawa. Just like Hisayuki, Yanagawa made his bones in the black market scene and gained a dangerous reputation in the Osaka and Hyogo prefectures. Yanagawa and Tanikawa eventually started a small Korean street gang and were doing decent business for a short period in the city of Amagasaki. However, in 1946, Yanagawa and Tanikawa were arrested after attacking and robbing a black market merchant. Yanagawa received 6 years, while Tanikawa received 12 years. While Jiro Yanagawa was locked up, Japan's underworld market began to change. By the early 1950s, Japan was almost fully recovered from the war, so necessities became abundant again nationwide. Therefore, Yakuza were not needed anymore in the black markets. This is when the Yakuza groups began to dive back into the non-essential rackets such as drugs, gambling, prostitution, and entertainment. Yakuza groups also began to infiltrate legitimate organizations like construction, real estate, and the entertainment industry. This made life harder for street gangs, but gave a new life to organized crime syndicates. This led to many more Koreans on the street joining Korean or Japanese Yakuza groups. Around this time, Machi Hisayuki's crime family, the Toseikai, grew in membership to almost 1,000 members, and Hisayuki became the main Zainichi Korean gangster in Japan. Jiro Yanagawa was released from prison in the mid-1950s and he decided to restart his criminal career. However, he was way behind Hisayuki in terms of power and influence. Yanagawa then formed his own gang, the Yanagawa Gumi, which at one point had a Korean-only membership. Yanagawa's old pal, Kotaro Tanikawa, was released from prison in 1958 and was put as second in command. The Yanagawa Gumi beat down most of the neighboring gangs in Osaka and expanded to be one of the largest Korean gangs in the country with membership at around 1,000 members. Yanagawa then caught the attention of Jimichi Yukio, who was a lieutenant in the Yamaguchi Gumi under Kazuo Taoka. Yanagawa and Yukio made a deal which officially brought the Yanagawa Gumi into the Yakuza world as a secondary group under the Yamaguchi Gumi. Yanagawa's gang came to be known as the Yamaguchi Killer Army because they did most of the fighting and absorbed the remaining Korean street gangs for their parent organization. Their efforts helped make the Yamaguchi group the largest crime syndicate in all of Japan. By the 1960s, the Toseikai grew to around 1,500 full members and were one of the most powerful crime syndicates in the country. They also became allied with the infamous Yamaguchi Gumi, which still had the Yanagawa Gumi as its auxiliary. Misayuki's criminal empire included tourism, entertainment, bars and restaurants, prostitution, oil importing, and weapons smuggling. However, the 1960s was when the Japanese government began a crusade against organized crime. This campaign hurt many gangsters, especially Machi Hisayuki and Jiro Yanagawa. Hisayuki was forced to disband the Toseikai after several major arrests. Jiro Yanagawa was arrested in 1964 along with his pal Kotaro Tanikawa. The two were sentenced to 7 years in prison together. While in prison, Yanagawa and Tanikawa decided to retire in order to pursue safer lives in legitimate business. After Yanagawa's retirement, he was asked why he became a Yakuza and he responded, "There is no discrimination against Koreans in the Yakuza society." Yanagawa went on to become a businessman and boxing promoter and he became the first IBF commissioner of Japan. Although Yanagawa retired, Machi Hisayuki stayed persistent. He created a new organization, the Towakai, and became the main Zainichi Korean in all of Japanese organized crime. Hisayuki continued to expand and use his influence in the Yakuza to help out Koreans in Japan and the motherland. Prominent Korean gangsters all around Japan began to work through legitimate organizations such as the Korean Residents Union in Japan and the Korean Youth League in Japan. The South Korean president Ron Tae-woo even thanked Hisayuki and other Zainichi Yakuza for their efforts. However, some saw this as a scheme in order for Yakuza to have a base away from home. Hisayuki is credited with using his influence to allow Japanese Yakuza to escape to Korea or do business in Korea with immunity. Hisayuki stayed in charge until his retirement in the 1980s. The Towakai continued to be one of the main Yakuza groups in the nation, and leadership was inherited by other Zainichi Koreans such as Hirano Fujimatsu, Morihiro Okita, and the current leader, Kaneumi Yoshio. In recent decades, Korean Yakuza profit off every possible illegal activity like drug smuggling, weapon smuggling, extortion, pornography, and illegal merchandise. They also have infiltrated many legitimate businesses such as construction, real estate, restaurants, and karaoke bars. But one thing the Korean gangsters dominate are pachinko parlors, which are casinos that specialize in Japanese-style slot machines. It was estimated that around 80% of pachinko parlors are owned by ethnic Koreans. Since Jiro Yanagawa and Machi Hisayuki paved the way for Zainichi Koreans in the underworld, Koreans have become overrepresented in all Yakuza groups. After the dissolution of the Korean Yanagawa group, many of its former members went on to form Yakuza groups of their own. Some even became lieutenants in the Yamaguchi Gumi, like Ishida Shoroku, whose real name was Park Tae-jun. Then we have men like Tokutaro Takayama, who led the Aizuko Tetsukai until his retirement in 1997. Or Shinichi Matsuyama, who is the leader of the Kyokuto Kai. Akira Takamura, who leads the Chiba-based Sowai Kai. Also, Makino Kuniyasu, who was the leader of the Matsuba Kai. And Namikawa Masahiro, who founded the Kyokushin Rengo Kai. In the 1990s, it was reported that 18 of the 90 top bosses of the Inagawa Kai were ethnic Koreans. One of these men was Jiro Kiyota, who led the group from the 90s up until recent years. Other honorable mentions are Hoshimito Hirofumi, who led the Kyokushin Rengo Kai, and Hiroyuki Joe, who was famous for stabbing and killing an Aum Shinrikyo cult member on live TV. There are countless names we can add to this list. However, we can't complete a Korean Yakuza list without mentioning Yamaguchi leader Yoshinori Oda. It's unclear if he is of full Korean heritage, but he revealed in an interview that his father was from Korea and a Yakuza as well. Oda was a loyal soldier for the Yamaguchi Gumi and served over a decade in prison for violent acts. However, he became best known for forming his own group which broke off from the Yamaguchi Gumi called the Ninkyo Yamaguchi Gumi. The original Yamaguchi group tried to assassinate him for the split, but his bodyguard was killed instead. Today, Oda has pledged to turn his group into a completely legitimate organization. As you can see, the Yakuza in Japan would be in a very different place without its Korean members. Today, Japan has around 500,000 Zainichi Koreans. They are still considered an underprivileged ethnic group, but in the modern world, the Japanese are more welcoming to foreigners than they used to be. Also, the Yakuza influence on society is decreasing as well, so Zainichi Koreans may not be forced into a life of crime like they once were. However, this doesn't change the role that Koreans played in the development of the Yakuza syndicates and the role that they continue to play to this day. Thank you for watching this video, and tune in for who we cover next time.